Today's virtual exploration takes place in Yorkshire, England's largest county. We'll start near Sheffield and then travel over to Bawtry, just south of Doncaster, then north to Reighton near Flamborough Head, and then west to sites at Kirkbymoorside, Thirsk and Leeming. The Sheffield Corporation operated a landing ground at Jordanthorpe, south of Sheffield, until the outbreak of the Second World War. The airfield had opened in 1915 as Royal Flying Corps Coal Aston, a home defence station. In 1916, the No. 2 Northern Aircraft Repair Depot and Engine Repair Depot opened on land to the north and the west of the site. The repair depots were extensive and included residential camps for men and women, and a narrow-gauge railway system for the movement of goods. The depots closed in 1919, and the site was taken over as a civil aerodrome by Sheffield Corporation. In July of that year, a 4-day event was held to promote aviation. The Vickers Company sent the prototype Vimy commercial, piloted by Captain Cockerell, to take part in the event. This was a passenger-carrying version of the famous Vimy bomber, which only the previous month had been flown non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean. Indeed, the recently benighted Sir John Alcock and Sir Arthur Whitton Brown attended the event, with Alcock operating several flights in the Vimy commercial. In spite of the enthusiasm shown, very little flying appears to have taken place on the site over the next decade. The Berkshire Aviation Company visited with a flying circus in 1921, and in 1929 Sir Alan Cobham arrived in his de Havilland Giant Moth to operate joyrides and to extol the virtues of his municipal aerodromes programme. Even with Sir Alan's backing, and 7 separate visits by the National Aviation Day display team, by the mid-1930s the field was being used for agricultural shows and other non-aviation events, and only one hangar remained. The whole site is now lost under the Jordanthorpe housing estate. In the 1960s, just to add some confusion, another aerodrome was built called Coal Aston, a mile or so southeast of the old airfield at Jordanthorpe. It was primarily built for British Steel, formerly United Steel, and their corporate Piaggio aircraft. It remains open today. In the 1990s, a completely new aerodrome was built just east of Sheffield City, on reclaimed mining land. I was there on the opening day in July 1997, operating flights in this Dragon Rapide. Sabina, British Airways and KLM all operated into the airport. By 2002, scheduled services ceased and the airfield closed in 2008. It's now a business park. Major George Peake purchased Bawtry Hall in 1905. His son Harold learnt to fly in the early 1930s, setting out a fine flying field to the south of the hall, complete with petrol pump and hangar for his Gypsy Moth. Harold Peake later became commanding officer of 609 Squadron, Royal Auxiliary Air Force, flying Hawker Harts and later on Supermarine Spitfires. The Bawtry Hall landing ground was used regularly throughout the 1930s, but closed at the outbreak of the Second World War. Nothing remains of the hangar site. The Royal Air Force might not have been interested in the landing ground, but they were certainly interested in Bawtry Hall itself. Bawtry Hall became RF Bawtry, headquarters for No. 1 Group Bomber Command. Operations continued at RAF Bawtry until 1986. The house is now used as a wedding venue. A new RAF aerodrome was constructed in 1941, just to the west of Bawtry. Although initially named RAF Bawtry, it was renamed RAF Burcoats to avoid confusion with the Hall, and was home to several operational training units and communications squadrons. RAF Burcoats closed in 1945, and being a grass aerodrome with just a concrete perimeter track, very little remains today. A landing ground was available for use at Reighton House near Filey throughout the 1930s. I haven't found out anything interesting about this landing ground, although the land itself still belongs to the same family. Major John Shaw of Welburn Hall, Kirkbymoorside, had a flying field about a mile south of the village. There was a hangar in which he kept this Avro Commodore, a 5-seat cabin biplane, powered by an Armstrong Siddeley Lynx engine. He also owned this Avro Cadet, which was unfortunately later lost in a fatal glider towing accident in 1939. In 1934, Major Shaw had been introduced to Fred Slingsby. Slingsby had served in the Royal Flying Corps during World War I as a gunner and observer, and earned the military medal. A skilled woodworker, he had built himself a copy of a German Falk glider around 1930. He started making and repairing gliders for customers, initially in the old tram sheds at Scarborough, which wasn't without its obvious hazards. Major Shaw offered Slingsby the use of better premises at Kirkbymoorside, and in 1936 Shaw and Slingsby went into partnership, trading as Slingsby sailplanes. By the late 1930s, a larger workshop was needed. Major Shaw purchased 2 redundant carriage washing sheds from Neasden Junction. These were erected on a new site on Ings Lane, just to the east of the landing ground. The new factory opened on the 4th of September 1939, the day after the Second World War broke out. The factory made flying surfaces for Avro Ansons, Hengist gliders and modified Waco gliders for the Royal Air Force. They also built gliders for the Air Training Corps, who continued to fly throughout the Second World War. Glider production for the civilian market resumed after the war, and Slingsby's experimented with a motor glider, the Motor Tutor, seen here, powered by an aeronca Jap engine. Slingsby also supplied Air Ministry approved wood for the repair and construction of aircraft by others. In 1961, Lieutenant Commander John Sproul, himself a pre-war employee of Slingsby's, repaired a certain well-known aeronca C3, with 2 new spars for the port wing being supplied by the Kirkbymoorside factory. Glider and motor glider production continued until the last glider left the factory in 1982. Major Shaw died in 1956. Fred Slingsby died in 1973, by which time Slingsby Aviation was owned by Vickers. The last aircraft to be built by Slingsby was the T-67 series, an adaptation of the French Fournier RF-6. Production ceased in 1995. The Kirkbymoorside factory remains today, trading as Marshall Slingsby Advanced Composites. Unfortunately, the adjoining landing ground closed some years ago. A landing ground was listed at Thirsk in the 1938 AA Landing Grounds Guide. It appears to have had no facilities whatsoever, and the site has been gobbled up by the Thirsk bypass and industrial development. A landing ground was opened by the Newton House Hotel, Londonderry, near Leeming, in 1932. The aerodrome seems to have been quite a success. By 1934 it was being run by Yorkshire Air Services. 2 hangars were built and a clubhouse with a flying school. Unfortunately, it wasn't to last. By the late 1930s, the RAF were looking for new sites for aerodromes, and the civil aerodrome closed in 1938, being incorporated into the much larger RAF Leeming. RAF Leeming opened in 1940 and remains open to this day. Thank you for watching.